Okay, so now we're looking at material that's going to be on your final. Final will be very much like the midterm, basically true, false, multiple choice, and it's going to cover material starting with well, most of it's actually going to cover um, stuff going on in the Cold War, since the Cold War goes on from 1945 to about 1992. So this lecture really is going to deal substantially with the 1950s, and mostly talking about the Cold War. So, one of the things you could check out on the actual Prezi presentation is some of these videos, especially looking at the music, since the 1950s is known as kind of the birth of rock and roll. There's music of Chuck Berry over here, and Elvis Presley, and some jazz as well that you can check out. So let's get going, and probably going to spend the most time just reflecting on this particular point on the Cold War, and then briefly on the presidency of Eisenhower. So the Cold War is this post World War II generation. It is starts with the presidency of Harry S. Truman, who's pictured here. Um, the United States had just won World War II, defeating the Japanese in late 1945, including the dropping of the atomic bombs. And it basically now takes a leadership role in global politics. So one way they do this, unlike in World War One, where they kind of ignored the League of Nations and went back to being somewhat isolationist, at least with European affairs. Now the U.S. is up front and as one of the leading nations of the United Nations. And Truman decided to this is what's going to be known as the Truman Doctrine. Truman decided to be very much an advocate for democracy across the globe. So the Truman Doctrine basically states that the United States would come to the aid and defense of free states. Now that's kind of a political statement. Um, and the Marshall Plan, which was policy of the U.S. to use its prosperity in order, and so it's in an economic way, because now the U.S. is out of the Great Depression. The 1950s is going to be the this big boom of economic growth in the United States. And so they're going to use this in order to like rebuild places like post-war Japan and post-war Germany, and create allies by doing that. Now, there's a fear, and rightfully so, because of spies and just this kind of belligerence coming out of the Soviet Union, with Stalin's leading this kind of communism of conquest. There's this fear that communism would spread like wildfire, and so under the advice of Keenan, there's this policy of containment that is going to be kind of part and parcel of the Cold War. So this is what this idea of a domino theory, that if one country goes communist, the surrounding countries of that country would then go communist, and so like a bunch of dominoes falling. So that is what led the U.S. all of a sudden to be super hyper aware, and to follow this policy of containment, where they would jump in and at sometimes overthrow popular elected leaders or very leftist leaders in order to install like military regimes that were anti-communist. And so the first place where you see the interventionist policy of the United States is the Korean War. So this map here kind of illustrates what goes on there. So what happened was, while the U.S. was kind of winning the hearts and minds in Western Europe, rebuilding Germany, and the Soviet Union was kind of left out, looking in on this progress by the U.S. The Soviet Union under Stalin backed the dictator of North Korea, who was in the Soviet Union before the Cold War started. But one of the policies of post-war deals was that Korea would be split between the Soviet Union and the United States. So what happened was that he gets the green light, and North Korea invades South Korea at the beginning of 1950. At some point, almost all South Korea is taken, and that's when the United Nations, under the leadership of the United States, intervenes. This is under General Douglas MacArthur, who was actually overseeing the rebuilding of Japan. And as you can see in the second part of the map, I should say, yeah, second part of the map, that the U.S. had and under the United Nations pushed back, almost taking all North Korea. Well, eventually, with the support of the Soviet Union and now China, because China had gone communist in 1949, there's another pushback, and potentially World War III is being dangled out there because China is directly involved. So eventually, Eisenhower is going to get involved, and he's going to push for armistice. And basically, that line that separates North Korea and South Korea still lasts today. But this is kind of typical of the Cold War, where one country would be very, how should I say this? It's a Cold War because no one country is directly fighting against the other, right? The Soviet Union never directly fights against the United States. We'll see the closest they get is the Cuban Missile Crisis. But what happens is one group will support its side of the conflict in a battle versus the other. Now, the Soviet Union successfully tested a bomb in the late 40s, and that led to this kind of bomb prevention, whether it was in cartoons or in just bomb drills that you see here like in American school. So there's this great fear of like this power in the East that was going to come and invade, that is going to lead into things like McCarthyism later. This fear of this other Red Scare that's going to take American society. Truman became president because he was FDR's VP, and so he ran again in 1948. And basically, the media had basically said that Truman didn't stand a chance. In fact, this is a famous picture of him holding up a paper that basically said that he lost the election, but in fact won. And he went on this like really rapid campaign at the end of of this time. So he does get reelected. He is going to give what's called the Fair Deal, and he wants to basically continue New Deal style politics. They don't get really off the ground. In fact, it'll be LBJ in the 1960s who really pushes some more of these liberal Democrat policies. But in general, he's kind of continuing the New Deal type of thing. And in fact, probably the most significant legislation he does is the executive order to desegregate the military. So let's go on and talk about the 1950s. So the 1950s is known as a time of like television, of marketing, right? So I have a couple of videos that go into like attention to the rise of adolescence. These kind of rebel without a cause figure like James Dean and Elvis Presley, Marilyn Monroe. The idea of like the nuclear family in the suburbs. You can see here in the Leave It to Beaver picture, or even the businessman and the figure of the gray flannel suit, the kind of organization man. And so that's kind of typical of the 1950s. It's definitely the rise of is a continual rise of the consumer culture. And now with the rise of the automobile and the television, marketing is used to sell things like, with the family getting together and going to enjoy a McDonald's hamburger. So Eisenhower will become president, and he basically is the president. So he becomes president after Truman, and he's basically president for the 1950s. So he's kind of his kind of face is connected to it. 50s kind of seen as kind of the quiet years. I do have a video posted that'll go a little bit more into Eisenhower, but the big thing, attached to like automobiles that I mentioned is that the United States is shrinking. You get the rise of the freeways, interstate highway system. So, the automobile and its connection to across the U.S. is coming into these big major building programs in the U.S. Globally, Ike does intervene in Guatemala and Iran. There's coups that happen there against Mossadegh, the prime minister in Iran, so to protect the power of the Shah, and in Guatemala to prevent what Arben's government in Guatemala is seen as too leftist, too quote unquote communist, and so it's overthrown. Vietnam, Eisenhower does not get the United States involved in Vietnam. At this point, France is still fighting against Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Cong. But Eisenhower does send advisors, but he will not get U.S. involved. Same thing with the Middle East. There is a crisis at the Suez Canal between Gamal Nasser, president of Egypt, and the leadership of Israel, France, and Britain. And Eisenhower actually advocates calm heads, but he does put the Middle East on the map. He says that the quote-unquote Eisenhower doctrine is this attention of the United States towards the Middle East. So you should definitely check out Eisenhower's farewell address here in this video, because he does warn about this idea of a military-industrial complex, the fact that the U.S. is spending exuberant amount of money on its defense system and the military, and he actually advocates, as a military man himself, remember this is a guy who staged D-Day, he planned D-Day out, so he's a military man, but he's actually very suspicious about the military industrial complex. So check out that video. And in fact, there is a lot of, within the intellectual circles of the United States, a lot of concern about leftist politics being labeled communist, especially like in Hollywood. Video on McCarthyism I attached. You can check out. There's actually films in Hollywood. The quality of films actually goes down. You get movies like this, The Red Menace, which is just awful. They're being made in the 50s, and so it's kind of a low period in entertainment when it comes to films as compared to like some of the classics in the 40s and later on the 60s. But it's a time where the CIA and the FBI are really gaining very extraordinary powers. And some of this is connected to the U.S. kind of being caught unawares and off its guard during the the bombing of Pearl Harbor, for example. So to close things off, I want you to just listen to some of the music that I have attached here. You got examples of Elvis and some jazz. And then finally, you can look at a sample from the movie Howl, which has that section of a poem of Ginsberg's poem. So these are the beat writers, Kerouac and Ginsberg, the most famous, and then William S. Burroughs as well. And they're all, these guys are all basically white men, writers who are just kind of just over this whole idea of like, hey, this is the suburbs are your future. You're basically going to live this kind of middle class American life, and they don't want it. They want something else. So like probably the most famous book of this group, On the Road by Kerouac, basically talks about these two guys jumping in an automobile, driving their car, and seeking out adventure across the U.S. So it kind of sets off that journey literature that's very popular in American lit. So but they kind of anticipate the 60s that are coming around. They also do seek out Eastern type spirituality. They're very into like Buddhism, for example, and so it shows how they're kind of not really feeling this return to American Protestantism that's very popular in the 1950s as well.